So my topic is new IT security risks that come with cloud solutions. It's kind of a misnomer. They're not really new. There's just a new emphasis. And they're kind of prioritized a little bit differently, at least in my mind, than just on-site network security. So let me move on. Again, this is my information. I'm director on the network side. My email's up there. That's just our main phone number. This will pop up again at the end, so no need to jot it down real quick. And why does this topic matter? I always like to start off that way, as you're sitting there wondering, why does this matter to me? A lot of times I'll take a poll. When we're in person, it's a lot more fun. I won't try to do it through this, but I asked to see a show of hands for people that use Office 365 for at least email. And the last couple times I've done this, I think we're up to about 75, 80% of people that pop their hands up. I see some hands going up. Awesome. Didn't know how many people knew how to do that. I could pick other ones, but Microsoft, especially 365, happens to be like the most common. So that gives us something that we can talk about that most people can relate to. So if you're using that, you're using a cloud provider. So all the things that I'm going to talk about during this next 15, 20 minutes, I'm going to use Microsoft for the most part as an example. Gartner's a very, very common research group. They always have some fun numbers to look at, and this is kind of an interesting one. They are predicting that through 2025, which this is kind of scary, but is only a few years away, 99% of the cloud security failures will be us, not the cloud provider. And that kind of shocks a lot of people because they just assume all these gigantic corporations like a Microsoft have super secure facilities and super secure software and offerings. Why are they not the ones responsible for all this? And that comes down to some unique things. If you're on Microsoft 365, you've agreed to their shared responsibility model, whether you realize it or not. If you look at all the fine print, this is one of the sections. I was tempted to copy and paste it here, but it gets very boring really fast. The gist of it is they will tell you right up front, here's what we're responsible for, and everything else is on you. So where do those lines get drawn? At the base level, any cloud provider, in our case Microsoft we're talking about, is responsible for the facilities where they have all these servers, all these pieces of actual hardware, nuts, bolts, all that. The utilities that feed those, the internet connection, heating and cooling, power, the people that go in and take care of the facilities, all that's on them. That's obvious. You would have no way of doing that anyway. That's why you're paying them. Everything on top of that, though, comes down to just some different levels. Three really common ones. And by the way, I tried to keep this in a specific order. So going from the least amount that they're responsible for to the SaaS where it's the most that the cloud provider is responsible for. Then we'll get into stuff you're responsible for. But starting at the least, it's still a lot, but the least amount they're responsible for is IaaS, infrastructure as a service. And that's kind of like what the bullet point above that is talking about. The nuts, the bolts, the utilities, the cables, all that stuff that there's no way for you to do and you wouldn't want to. They are providing that. As soon as you do anything else on top of that, it's you. So as soon as you install a server or workstation operating system, everything from that point on is you. They're only responsible for the bullet point above. The next step up is platform as a service. And in that case, they are responsible for the operating system, patches, security. They'll make sure that that stuff is all in place. And again, I'm making this very specific to Microsoft. Some people's platform as a service is a little bit different from this, but they have a lot of common areas. And then the one where they're responsible for the most is software as a service. And this would be things like, I don't know why the one that always comes to mind, which is not a good example probably in a Sage presentation, is QuickBooks. But QuickBooks Online, very popular for the QuickBooks users. They keep everything up to date. So they have the QuickBooks install, the version, any updates that come out, patches, security, all that, they are responsible for. And that sounds awesome. Microsoft is responsible on the email side for everything right up until the point where you touch it. So that's an important handoff. And here is what we are responsible for. And I say we as the consumers. The biggest one is the first one listed, identity and access management. Then application configurations and data. And if you look at each one of these, it makes sense. Just like I said before, we can't be responsible for the hardware, the cables, the nuts, the bolts, the utilities. Well, turn that around. They can't be responsible for identity and access management. They can't make you create specific users with specific passwords. We wouldn't want them to. So if you create a user with a super easy to guess password and cut them loose, that's on you if there is a breach. Same thing with application configurations. They can lock those down to a certain extent, but as most of you, I'm sure, are aware, that's one of the first things people complain about when they move from an on-site application to a cloud is, oh, it's nice, but it's so locked down. I can't do all the things I wanted to do. Well, a lot of times it's because of this. If they totally open that up, there could be some misconfiguration, which would create security holes. And then the last thing, of course, is data. They can't control what you put on those servers. So whether you're putting personal information, client stuff, things that would be at risk, that's on you. So here are some of the actual threats themselves. Not super specific. I'm still keeping this kind of broad, and then we'll talk about how you can address those. But the first one, as I said, insufficient identity access management, credentials, any of that, if that's not secure, that's a problem. Here's the next one that's interesting. I don't spend a lot of time on insufficient identity. That one's kind of obvious, but the next two are not. Insecure interfaces and APIs. So one of the first things people want to do when they move to a cloud app is get it to talk to another app, whether it's another cloud app or something on site and maybe even a piece of equipment. But one of the first things they want to do is open up that app. That can create problems if they're not doing it in a secure way. And the one that almost no one's going to think of is unsecure third-party resources. So several years ago, I know I got my first call from a client who was asking some very detailed questions about what we use to support them. And I finally asked why they were asking all this. Was there a problem? What's going on? And it was insurance based. Their insurance provider, cybersecurity, told them it's no longer enough just to know that DWD is your outsourced IT group. Let's say this particular one, we're a managed services provider. They want to know who we use and what tools we use to provide those services, because they're not just going to take your word for it anymore. And the same thing goes for us as a consumer. So Datto, if anybody's heard of that, for backup, for remote monitoring and management, that's one of our big partners. Before, we could just ask them, are you secure? Yes, we're secure. We're telling you we're secure. Now we have to say, okay, who do you use, Datto, to provide your services? And they have a dynamic document that sits on their website that we can get to via a link anytime we need to provide that to one of our insurance providers. So we get to see it from both sides. A lot of fun. How do you protect yourself? Now for the good stuff. So number one, and by the way, it used to be whenever I would talk security, local network stuff, it was almost always the very first thing out of the gate was backups. I will have one bullet point up there for backups. It's kind of slid down the list. Doesn't mean it's not hugely important, but at this stage of the game, I think most people are aware of how important backups are. And why backups are important here for the cloud's a little bit different. So I've moved that down, but just to explain why that's not showing up is the very first thing I talk about. Require secure passwords. Whenever you're setting up users, your first user, or you, if you're the administrator especially, you want to have secure passwords. This used to mean 8 characters in length, and then 2 or 3 of 4 requirements like uppercase, lowercase, numbers, special characters. This has been changing over the last year or so. A lot of companies, Microsoft included, are saying now, let's make them really strong. But one thing they were saying before, which was change them often, they're now saying don't change them often. So it's kind of a give and take. What everybody's finding is when you ask people to change passwords all the time, they try to get creative by adding like a 1 or a 2 or a 3 or an exclamation mark at the end of the same password they had used before because they're tired of changing them every month. Or they get to the point where they can't remember because they just changed this thing for the 5th time, so they're jotting it down on a sticky note, putting it on their computer. Worst cases, and unfortunately we see this all the time, a laptop will come, someone will drop a laptop off here for one of the people to look at, one of our techs, and they open it up and there's the password right on the keyboard, right under the keyboard of the laptop. And it wasn't that they just put it on there. You can tell it's been taped there for a long time because they were tired of remembering it. So if anybody snagged that laptop, they're in. So the new way of looking at this is very secure passwords that you don't have to change all that often. And another important requirement, don't reuse. So if you're using Sage, let's say online, it's a hosted provider and you have a very strong password, that's great. You only have to change it once a year, that's awesome. Don't also use that password for Netflix. Don't use that password for Gmail. Don't, even though it may be an awesome password, you're so proud of it, it's super strong, it's something you can remember, you don't want to have to come up with another one, don't reuse them. To come up with all these super strong passwords and have a bunch of them, you may want to consider something like LastPass or some other kind of password management tool. If you want to email me, I know the last user conference just last week, several people wanted to email later and ask for a list of some recommendations maybe. We use LastPass, we like that. That's a nice one. The second one that goes right along with the first is use multi-factor authentication. I know tons of people have to use this now. When we first started talking multi-factor, it was just groans that we heard. You'd ask for a show of hands how many people had to use it, like with their banks or whoever. You'd get a few. Now, I think the last time I asked, again, it was like 80% of the room has used multi-factor in some way and uses it actively in a lot of ways. Just get used to it. It doesn't mean you have to like it, but it has gotten a lot easier. A lot of the multi-factor apps are very simple. It's not that you have to get sent a code and enter that code somewhere. It's just your app shows up on the phone and says, is this you? You tap yes, and you're off and running. So if you've used Duo, that's one that I know we use internally and a lot of our clients use. That one's super easy to use, but man, that really protects you. Even if your password is compromised, they can't get in. So it's kind of a must anymore. Create least privilege roles. This is something a lot of people don't think about, but let's just say you have 20 users in your network, only 3 of which need access to financials to do their job. The other 17 users should not have access to financials. So you only want to give people rights to stuff they need to do their jobs. That's it. Disable inactive accounts. This is boring, but it's just cleanup, and hopefully it's either on your calendar or we'll go on there after this. Just every quarter, 6 months, even worst case a year even, go through your Active Directory. It may be Azure Active Directory if you don't have any local servers anymore, if you're totally online, but go through your users, because every time we sit down with a client and do this, it seems like every single time somebody comes up, oh, they're not with us anymore, they're not with the company anymore, but their account's not disabled. So huge risk on that because you don't know what they're doing once they're outside. So many usernames now are just an email address, so very easy to guess. And if they're using the password they were using at your company in whatever new company, or like I said before, Netflix, somewhere else, and it gets compromised, you could possibly be compromised. So kind of be vigilant there on the inactive accounts. Provide anti-phishing training. If you've heard of Know before, that's probably the biggest player in the field. That's who we use. We have several clients using that as well. But anti-phishing, usually these providers include training, and then kind of the key part of what they provide is test phishing emails. So they will randomly send out emails to your employees to try to get them to bite. And if they do, they click on something they shouldn't. Different providers handle this differently, but for the most part in this, if you click on something you shouldn't, it comes up and tells you that and then tells you why. I know with KnowBe4, they have several different levels, and depending on what level, it'll be more informative, I guess, or more verbose about telling you why. And then it'll also tell you, based on what the administrator of the product has chosen, whether you have to go get some training. It could be a 3-minute video, 5-minute video, or whether it's just a warning, don't do it again. But what we have found, this is really, really effective. I had my doubts when these things first came out. I thought they'd be effective for a while and then it would kind of wear off, but they're not. They actually really keep people on their toes. You can make this fun if you don't want to make it a an employee bashing thing for people that click on something they shouldn't. But awesome tool, very nice and not all that expensive. Here, finally, backups show up. They're not really that far down on the priority list, but backup for the cloud has kind of have changed a little bit. It's still really, really important. So since I'm using 365 as my example here, and a lot of things, I'll talk about that. So the shared responsibility model for Microsoft also includes reference to backups. They don't do backups for you. They have a super, super robust system. It rarely goes down. When it does, it's not down for very long, but they're not keeping long-term data and information for you for your 365 stuff, your email, your Teams, OneDrive. I think it's 30 days now is what they will claim to keep. But if you have somebody delete something and a month or two, more than a month or two out, they have to go back and try to get it, it's most likely gone. Just not going to be able to grab it. There are cloud-to-cloud backup systems. Datto, I mentioned before, we use for a lot of things. They also have one, used to be called Backupify. If you want information on any of these things, Datto's not the only one. Be more than happy to give you some, but they're also not very expensive. But most people just don't think about it because they think Microsoft's got them covered. And Microsoft is very good at the redundancy piece and keeping their stuff up and running, but they are not taking any responsibility for long-term backups for you. So backups are still important, but the cloud providers are getting very good at blocking encryption. And that used to be whenever we talk security, we said backups are your best friend, because if you come in and get ransomwared and somebody says either pay or we're not going to give you the key to decrypt your files, that's kind of changed in the cloud because the cloud providers are pretty good at keeping their stuff from getting encrypted in the first place. But what the bad guys are doing now is they're copying the data. So they're not going in to encrypt it. They're actually going in and slowly, if they have to, so they don't raise any red flags, they will copy part or all data off. And then the threat you get is, we're going to publish it. So if you don't pay, we will publish your information. And if you don't have any information or data that you care gets published, then not a huge deal. But backups don't help you with that. And the other bad thing about that is they can keep doing it. So unlike the encryption thing where they send you a key, you decrypt, you're back up and running, and then you're trying to strengthen yourself, with the we'll publish thing, there's nothing that keeps them from trying that once a month and just coming back and hitting you until you make that data no longer a risk, which for obvious reasons is really difficult to do. And the last one is, now that your application, let's just say it is just one, but let's, I guess, say you have multiple out there in the cloud, you don't really have servers and stuff locally that you have to strengthen. You're not worried about access to that as much. Your access, the gateway to your data and your applications is now through the endpoints. So you have to make sure you're really creating very, very tough to get through, tough to break endpoint security. Anti-malware, antivirus, stuff like Trend, Bitdefender, those are excellent. If you want to take a step up, there's endpoint detect and response. That's what that EDR stands for. There's all kinds of new terms coming out on how this works, and AI this, AI that. They are more robust. They give you some failback features a lot of times, like the one we use is Sentinel-1. And if it detects a breach or somebody in doing something they're not supposed to be, it even has the ability to cut that computer off from the network. but allow us still access so we can go in and fight that. We can even roll back to a previous good image on the workstation. So they're a little bit more expensive than your standard anti-malware antivirus, but obviously additional features. So if you start seeing that term endpoint detect and response, EDR, endpoint detect management, I think is another way they say it, but anything that starts with endpoint, that's what they're talking about. They're just trying to beef it up, but hugely important. I know we have several clients now who don't even have an office. Everybody works independently. All every worker has is a laptop, so there is no one firewall to get them behind and strengthen. Every one of their endpoints now is what we have to worry about. So hopefully that makes sense. And again, trying to keep the time shorter. Oh, not too bad. My email is up. My phone number's there. Also, anyone you know on the Sage side can get you in touch with me. But if you want any more information, or just want some clarification maybe on something I mentioned, or even some recommendations, feel free to shoot me an email and I will respond.